Hi, I'm Brenda Wall. I'm a lawyer and mediator in the Northern Shenandoah Valley in Virginia and West Virginia. And today I'm joining you to discuss a little bit about property division and divorce in West Virginia. In mediation, a lot of parties have questions about what the court would do or what the law is with regard to property division. And so I hope to be able to give you a background to help you to be able to understand a little bit about that here today. Remember, this is not legal advice, it's some general information. I am not anyone's attorney here, and as a matter of fact, I don't accept cases in family law for representation, only as a mediator. The only thing we're talking about here is Virginia and West Virginia law, and other states would be very different. So bear all of that in mind. So let's talk about what happens to the property in a divorce. The question is, you've spent years living together, you've amassed property, vehicles, bank accounts, and so on. What happens? The law in West Virginia is that when parties divorce, the property is divided fairly or equitably. The term that's used is equitable distribution. All marital property is subject to equitable distribution. And so the next question is, okay, then what's marital property and what's separate property? Marital property tends to be any property at all that's acquired during the marriage. Separate property is property that is acquired outside the marriage. That can happen in a number of ways. One, maybe the party has this item, for example, this old camera before they got married. And so it's not marital property because they owned it before the marriage occurred. Another way it happens is if somebody inherits something and they keep it only in their name, then that is usually not going to be considered marital property. So for example, if someone passed away and left this in their will to their niece or nephew and they kept it, that would be separate property. Other separate property sometimes has to do with what people may have acquired outside the marriage. But again, it tends to be only property that was definitely a gift to a person, an inheritance, or something acquired prior to the marriage that stayed only in that person's name. Generally speaking, in West Virginia, when another person's name is put on that property, it converts it into marital property. So marital property is all property acquired during the marriage. Sometimes it can be difficult to separate marital and separable property when it gets mixed up. That can happen particularly like with real property. So suppose somebody owns a house and then they get married and then they remodel the house. That may be partially marital, partially separate, and the law is very fact specific about that. So it's impossible to make a generalization about what would happen under those conditions. But what I can say is that when you have partially marital, partially separate property, that becomes an issue that you either resolve through litigation or through mediation. What happens when you've got separate property and you mix it? As a general rule in West Virginia, when non-marital and marital property is mixed up, if you have a bank account that has money that you had before the marriage, and then you turn it into a joint bank account, generally speaking, the law in West Virginia is that's considered a gift and it becomes all marital property. So as long as it's neatly divided and stacks the way you see it on the one side of the screen, that can be separate property. But once you put it all in that jar like that, the courts tend to look at that as all marital property. So the next question is, how do we go about sorting it out? Who gets what? How do we know what's equitable? Well, to know what's equitable, you have to know the value of all of that marital property. And so what happens is you have to come up with values. There are a number of ways to do that. These are some considerations to make when you decide what date you are going to use to value your property. You may want to use the date of separation. You may want to do a date of mediation. You may want to pick any number of dates. But these are some considerations when you're looking at values because it can be difficult to address valuations, especially when markets are constantly changing. So again, you can use any number of dates. I mentioned this before, the date of separation, court hearing, any other date that you might agree to or that you think is equitable and fair. Once you've got your list of property that was acquired during the marriage, then you need to know how much it was worth on this particular date. To figure out the value, you can use a number of different tools. With regard to vehicles, we tend to use an ADA value, or some people use the Kelly Blue Book. Whichever you use, just make sure everybody's in the marriage is using the exact same tool. You can use a tax assessment. And then, of course, records on stocks is pretty clear cut as our credit card statements. With houses, people tend to use either the appraisal, or they get a fair market value from a realtor, or they look at Zillow or something like that and agree to an amount. So the question becomes is what are the factors on division? How does the court decide what's equitable? And the court can look at these other factors. However, generally speaking, in most of the divorces I've done since 1987 as a mediator or as a lawyer, the division tended to be equitable. The only time that wasn't the case is when someone did something to really depreciate the value of the marital property, such as just destroyed it intentionally. I also had a case one time where somebody depreciated the value by because they had a gambling addiction and they had gone through a lot of the marital assets. So there are times when it's not a complete 50-50 and it's still equitable, but that tends to be the exception and not the rule. So if you have more questions, you can ask them to me for free. Just go online to brendawell.com and schedule a free free consultation. I'll be happy to answer your questions. You may also look for other videos that we have that address child custody and also the processes that you can use for divorce. So I hope this has been helpful to you in making decisions on how to move forward, and I hope that I will get to meet you at a free consultation.